Alright, so first and foremost, before we get into the video, I just want to take a moment to let you know that every once in a while, throughout the course of the next couple of videos, as we talk about the mind and thought and all of that stuff, I just want to let you know that I'm going to drop a little bit of Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey in here from time to time, simply because I find it interesting and kind of helpful in talking about this stuff, at least making this mind and thought stuff more interesting, turns it into more of a story, so it's a little bit more entertaining to talk about. And I'm going to do that here because, with that all being said, one of the most perilous and interesting points in the hero's journey is the transition of the hero transitioning from existing in the ordinary world of the known and the mundane, and then crossing this point of no return, crossing this threshold into the extraordinary world of the unknown, the uncertain, and chaotic domain. And usually before that occurs, something interesting happens. A mentor or an older gentleman or person or god or goddess or whatever gives the hero a weapon or a tool or something or armor or whatever to help them traverse the perilous unknown, the chaotic unknown. And, usually this comes in the form of just getting a simple weapon or a sword. With Link from the Legend of Zelda, he gets the Master Sword from that old man. And you also have, Luke Skywalker getting his lightsaber from Obi-Wan Kenobi before he goes off on his adventure. And then it doesn't have to be a sword or a weapon or anything. It can be armor too. It's just like Frodo from Lord of the Rings. He gets mithril armor from Bilbo Baggins, he's an old guy too. He's an old hobbit. So in keeping with this trope and tradition, in order for us to cross into the threshold and start talking about the mind and diving into that dangerous, chaotic realm, we're going to need a weapon or a tool to help protect us as we dive into this very perilous and dangerous world, and do it without fear. And what that is going to be, what this tool is going to be, is the knowledge of the fact that you are not your thoughts. Okay? So we're going to get into it here, because if you haven't done so already, it is a must, it is an imperative that you differentiate yourself from your thoughts. I do not want to talk about this stuff unless we first talk about the fact of the matter that you are not your thoughts, that your thoughts are just experiences that you have, okay? And I want to point out that I don't use the word must or have to or need to very often, because I want people to be able to make their own mistakes. I want them to, you should do this. I tell people that you should do this, or you ought to do this, or the ideal state is this. But I still want you to experience it for yourself and to have your own trials and tribulations and experience all of that stuff. But in this particular case, I cannot in good faith talk about this stuff without first making a video about this very deep Eckhart Tolle sort of thing, this idea that you are not your thoughts, okay? Because we got to go deep and into this dark and dangerous realm, this realm where we are trying to understand our very own capacity for evil. And I can't do that without first giving you the one tool that's necessary in order to protect yourself from the trauma that can be created from doing this without this understanding. So the first thing that I have to do is talk about this idea of your mental world or your inner world and kind of break it apart, make sure that you know what I'm talking about, and then also talk about the outer objective world as well, and talk about how both of them are actually one in the same. And in order for me to do that, we got to jump down a little bit of a rabbit hole and talk about the non-dual nature of the universe. So that's what I'm going to do in the next couple of minutes. And expect a couple of rabbit holes in this video that I'm looking forward to talking about. And so, what is this division? What am I talking about here? Well, this division is between you, the individual, and the collective, everyone else. Okay? Well, what is this division? This division is actually an illusion. It's not real. And it's something that we have to overcome if we're going to understand thought more effectively. Okay? And so it's also something that this barrier, this division, this illusory division is also causing a lot of pain and suffering in our lives as well. So that's another very important reason to talk about this. And so something odd is occurring when it comes to the nature of language, communication, and socialization. And it appears that it actually creates this division between an individual's subjective thoughts and feelings, what we would perceive as our inner world, and the collective's objective actions and states of being in what we would perceive as the outer world. And what that is called, this inner and outer world thing, is called duality. And duality is not real, something that we don't perceive, or we perceive it, but we don't want to, it's not factual. What is more factual is this idea of non-duality, okay? And so we only have to just go to the general principles of natural law, the first two of them, to actually clarify this, okay? And the first principle is the principle of mentalism, which states that the mind is all. Everything in the universe is mental, okay? So that's your inner world and your outer world. It's all mental. It's all a product of the mind, okay? This is consciousness, okay? This is, that's what this is, okay? The second principle is the principle of correspondence, which states that that which is above is like to that which is below, and that which is below is like to that which is above. The very large in totality, the collective, the macrocosm, and the very small individuals that make up the collective, that make up the macrocosm, the microcosm, these two things are mirror reflections of each other, okay? The individual and the collective are mirror reflections of one another. You don't actually have an inner world. Everything should be objective and should be seen as objective. And so, as within, so another way is saying as within, so without. Subjective interpretation and objective interpretation are, or ought to be, one in the same. And when they're not, when you're being untruthful about what is occurring in your inner world to somebody else, when you're not being truthful, you're not experiencing truthfulness, that's when we are most primarily lying, because it's only when we're talking about our thoughts and feelings, our subjective thoughts and feelings, is when we're talking about something that we actually can lie about. Because it's really hard to talk about things that are occurring outside of our state of being to other people and lie to them about it, okay? Like very simply, like if I say that it's raining outside, it's very easy for another individual to look outside and say, hey, it's not raining, why did you lie about that? But when it comes to thoughts and feelings, those things are much harder, pretty much impossible for any other individual to know about. And so this is actually the reason why language and communication plays a fundamental role in creating the division between inner and outer world. And this is actually because language and communication and this idea of socialization in general actually creates the inner and outer world. It is what is the structure behind these two things. We don't actually have an inner world without language and communication. We don't even actually have an outer world without language and communication. You have no thoughts inside of your head without language, okay? And you don't have any reason to communicate to others without language or communication also. And language encompasses all things. So language encompasses all things where you're trying to communicate with another individual. That's what I'm talking about with language. So, if you look at like very primitive, or you can just look at wolves. Wolves have a type of language, a type of way to socialize with themselves that actually creates a group, a community, a collective of wolves, a pack of wolves, okay? We have the same thing going on, except ours is many times more sophisticated. But without language and communication and socialization, there is no need for this inner world or outer world. There's no need to talk about your thoughts and feelings to another individual if there's no individual to talk to. And so, the technology of language and communication itself actually formed the illusion of the inner world of the individual, of individual thought and feeling, while simultaneously creating the outer world of collective socialization. The point is, for me bringing it up, is that this language, our language, is simply a code to our matrix. It doesn't actually exist in reality. And, just look at a tree. So a tree is called a tree simply because a whole bunch of people looked at this image of what appears to be a tree, and they all agreed we're going to call that a tree because it is, just easier to label that thing a tree so that you know what I'm talking about. And then likewise, it's perfectly fine for another collective of people to call that tree eine Baum, which is tree in German, because these are just labels that allow people to talk about things. It makes it easier for them to communicate what could be life-changing, life-altering, life-saving information at a much more rapid rate. Okay? And so, from the perspective of conversation, we actually experience this idea of truthfulness, because truthfulness, being truthful, is the individual's ability to express their subjective thoughts and feelings to another. Truthfulness actually has nothing to do with the collective. It has everything to do with the individual, because only the individual can express their own thoughts and feelings to another individual. And so, unless you're having a conversation with a psychiatrist or a psychologist who's been working with you for years upon years upon years, just like a side note, just never let anyone tell you how you're thinking or feeling, because there's no way for them to ever know, especially over the internet. Someone says, no, you're thinking this or you're feeling this. They can't know that, okay? There's no way for them to know that. And for a lot of people, it's very hard for them to even know what they're thinking and feeling because they haven't really thought about it that much. But the point is that, you should always be truthful and be your most authentic self, truthfully expressing how you think and feel to other people, basically breaking apart this illusory divide between inner world and outer world by doing the actions in the real world that you want to do and expressing your thoughts and feelings to other individuals as best that you possibly can. Okay, let's get out of this rabbit hole and get back into talking about thought differentiation from the self. So the first thing that we have to understand is that differentiating yourself from your thoughts is actually not a big deal, because it's actually a very simple process of realization. The realization is that your thoughts are just experiences that you have very little control over. And it's the correct perspective to have. And so it's not something that we have to lie to ourselves about. This is the correct idea that you should have on thoughts. They are experiences that we have, and they're very uncertain. It's very likely that you're going to have a number of thoughts that you have no control over. And we're going to talk about this lack of, or this, what do you say? It's a very circumstantial experience when you're having thoughts. Like, you could just be walking down the street and just bump into something that forces you to have a weird thought, and that's perfectly fine. The only thing that I want to point out is that, or the thing I want to point out here before we talk about this later on, is that morality, the objective knowledge of right and wrong behavior, right and wrong actions in the real world, it doesn't concern itself with thought or feelings, because it understands that you're going to have thoughts that are immoral at times, or you're going to have angry feelings towards another, and it doesn't really care about you actually having those thoughts. It only worries itself about you actually acting on those thoughts and feelings, okay? Because, you could have the deepest, darkest thought of all time, and so long as you don't act upon it, you're not infringing on the rights of any other individual. And so feel free to have weird and interesting thoughts. Feel free to feel your feelings, even if they feel angry or they challenge your ability to control them. So long as you don't act upon them, it's perfectly fine to and warranted to have these experiences, as we'll talk about. So all you need to do is realize and then recognize that you're not any of your thoughts. This is the process to thought differentiation. Realize and recognize that you are not any of your thoughts. You are not your thoughts. You are not your ideas. You are not your beliefs. You're not your ideologies, or whatever that is, okay? Everything that you think that sounds good, okay? Because it's very easy for us to say, oh, I'm not that bad thought. I'm not that negative thought. But that good thought over there, oh yeah, that's me. No. This points out that you're not your good thoughts either. You're not your good ideas. You're not the ideas that you like either. You're not any of those abstract structures that you understand, any of those things that you believe to be true and have accepted as a part of you, as a part of your being. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I think it's fortunately, none of that can be you. None of it is you, okay? Your thoughts are occurring by circumstance, by reading a book, watching a movie, listening to a video, walking down the street, and none of this makes you who you are. These are just experiences that you're having, okay? And so also remember that your thoughts are all stolen from other people's thoughts and experiences. And so they aren't yours. They aren't you. No one's ever really, it's very rare for people to come up with a real original thought that isn't just an evolution upon a past thought. I don't think I can't think of a time where it's a very rare thing to happen. It's when it does happen, it is fascinating, like general relativity and that sort of stuff. The sort of stuff that completely changes an entire field of study. Okay. And so, with that being said, there is and even with that, like general relativity, it was all built upon all of these other thoughts and ideas that Einstein utilized in order to rethink space and time. But the idea here is that none of these thoughts are yours. You can claim no ownership to them. The only thing that you can claim ownership to, which is what we talked about in previous videos, is your actions and your property. And that's perfectly fine to claim ownership to that. But these thoughts, these are much more illusory, and they are not illusory, but because they are real experiences. But you can't claim ownership to them. They're just they don't have a physical thing. And remember, I was talking about when we were talking about property rights, how in order for people to claim ownership over something like liberty or freedom, they actually had to take it out of the realm of the mental realm and bring it into a place, turn it into a noun that they could claim ownership over. And this is great. This is a freeing thing, because what this means is that you're no longer responsible for your thoughts, ideas, beliefs, or any of that stuff that you have or that you may have. And really, all that you can do with thoughts is experience your thoughts and either pay more or less attention to the thoughts that you have. And differentiating yourself from your thoughts actually allows you to pay way less attention to certain particular thoughts that you really don't want to pay attention to, because you know for a fact that these thoughts aren't you and therefore are unimportant to your self-obsessive egos. Okay, so we all have this idea of an ego within us, and our egos are obsessed over us. And so if we differentiate ourselves from our thoughts, then our egos can't associate these thoughts as part of us. And we're going to talk about that too. So differentiation of thoughts allows us to circumvent our own egoic mechanisms. And so just for a simple example, the other day while I was walking down the street, this was pretty intense. I was just walking down the street, just left the bar that my best friend owns, and I was having a pretty good time, and I noticed that there was an ambulance in front of me, and I was like, that's pretty interesting. And then right in front of me, a group of paramedics pull out a dude who had just been beaten up or something. He was getting taken out of another restaurant, and he was on one of those stretcher things, mobile stretcher things, and he was bloodied up. Like, he had bruises on his eyes. One of his eyes was bleeding very badly. There were cuts all over his body because he's like a chef, so he had that big white shirt on, but there was so much deep, dark red blood all over him. And he was getting taken into the ambulance. And, this is the idea of chance and circumstance causing me to have thoughts. Okay, and this is why we have no control over the thoughts that we have. Sometimes something just pops up out of the blue, out of nowhere, that we don't want to think about really, and it puts it at the forefront. And so that's a fairly traumatic event, certainly for that guy, and also for me for just experiencing that when I wasn't expecting to experience that. And so it obviously created thoughts inside of my head. And fortunately for me, I think about this stuff all the time, so I have differentiated myself from my thoughts. But had I not, and had I just allowed that experience to overcome me and allowed all of these questions to start popping up into my head, I could start wondering about my own mortality. I could start worrying about my family. Like, what if that happened to my family? What would I do then? What if my little sister was beaten up like that? Like, oh man, the world's so unsafe and dangerous and scary. And you see how this can kind of spiral into a very obsessive, scared state of being. A very fearful state of being. And, as we'll learn, there's nothing wrong with having these thoughts, okay? The only problem arises when we do not differentiate ourselves from these thoughts, when we don't differentiate ourselves from these questions. It's okay to question these things, We just have to make sure that we don't fall into a self-obsessive tendency, a fearful tendency from having these thoughts. So in order to get an idea of what I'm talking about with these experiences and them not being a part of you and how this outer world and inner world are one and the same, I want you to think about a bead of mercury. A bead of mercury, when it's created, and it makes like a little sphere, and it reflects light. So it gives you a 360-degree mirror reflection of the environment that it finds itself within. That's what I want you to think that's at the center of your being, okay? And when I'm talking about the center of your being, I'm talking about all experiences that you can have. It's reflecting the entire environment that the bead of mercury finds itself in. It's reflecting every experience that you have. So this bead of mercury being within you, this includes that it's within your thoughts and your emotions and your perceptions and your beliefs and your ideologies as well. Okay, so it's deeper than just your inner world. Okay, and so what you're getting is a mirror reflection of all experiences that you can have. Your inner world perceived thoughts and feelings, it's reflecting that out, and it's reflecting out the objective reality that you find yourself in, as well as it traverses that illusory boundary between the objective and the subjective. And so you're not your experiences, but it's your experiences they're reflecting back at you. Okay? And this is occurring when we think. This is why when we think about our experiences, what we're doing is reflecting on our experiences, and it's a mirror world in there, and it's very, very weird, and we can jump down another rabbit hole to talk about it, which I guess we'll do. Why not? This video has gotten weird enough already, so let's just do it, because perhaps we can ask ourselves some pretty weird questions when we point out the fact that we are not our thoughts, we are not our feelings, we're not our actions. These are all experiences that we have. And it's like, well, if we're not any of that stuff, if we're not that consciousness or what that is, then what are we? Well, if we just look at myself, people call me Justin. That's my name, but that's not me. I am not Justin. That's just what they call me to differentiate me. Okay? I'm not a content creator. It's just something that I do. It's the action that I do during in the morning. Likewise, I'm not American. Being American, that's just a nationality. That's just where I find myself on this planet. I'm not 30 years old. 30 is just how many times I've traversed around the sun in this human form. Speaking of human forms, I'm not this body. This body is just used by me to traverse physical reality. And I'm not even the mind, because the mind is the matrix itself. So I am none of this stuff that we would normally associate ourselves with. And that begs the question, if we're none of this stuff, then who are we? Like, what are we? Are we the awareness? Are we the thing that gives the attention to something? Not really either, because as it turns out, there is no ball of mercury at your center of being. There is nothing there. And since there is no barrier between subjective and objective, there is no difference between the individual and the collective, even though the collective and the individual create themselves. And so what I'm talking about is this idea of the lowercase self versus the uppercase self. What I'm talking about here is the lowercase self, which is not real. It's not a real thing. It doesn't exist. We have to understand that our reality is Maya. Our physical reality is Maya. It's an illusion. All of it's not real. So that also includes our bodies and our minds as well. You are not your body. You are not even your mind. And we're not real. And that's okay, because, the interesting thing about non-existence, if you say that the only thing that exists is non-existence, that's a juicy contradiction, because what it is ignoring is the fact that if the only thing that exists is non-existence, then something exists, and that thing just happens to be non-existence, which is great because we can look at the principle of polarity, and the opposite of non-existence is existence. So non-existence needs existence in order to exist, and existence needs non-existence in order to exist. It's like the yin-yang symbol. The little black dot creates that entire white fish thing, and then the little white dot creates the entire black fish thing, and the opposite creates its polar opposite. They need each other there because they're ultimately one in the same. And so the point of me talking about that, jumping down that rabbit hole, is just to point out that there's no one singular place that is distinctly you. There's no one thing that is distinctly you or distinctly defined as you in your inner being or wherever. And that's okay. It's perfectly normal and natural and fine, okay? You never needed you anyway. But getting out of this rabbit hole, getting back on track, talking about this idea of differentiating ourselves from our thoughts, accepting that we're going to have weird thoughts from time to time, and these things are just going to pop into our heads. Well, that kind of sounds like a dereliction of duty, doesn't it? We're responsible individuals, we're grown-ups, we say things like, Jocko Willink's extreme ownership. We take responsibility for our actions in the real world. Why wouldn't we take responsibility for our thoughts as well? Well, it's because that's not really how thoughts and feelings work. You have to allow them to express themselves within you, or perceptually within you, and experience them and let them actually do their thing. Don't try to fight them or battle them or go to war with them. They're just experiences that you're having. So, it's kind of like free-range chicken, The chickens just happen to taste better when you allow them to walk around and have a real chicken life, as opposed to just cramming them into those little houses and force-feeding them all day long. Free-range chicken tastes better. And your thoughts will be more expressive, and you'll be able to dive deeper with them if you allow them to express themselves and just observe them as if you're like a scientist observing, any sort of subject, observing some rats in a maze, or, observing humans in the Milgram experiment. Just observe them as objectively as you possibly can, because remember, your inner world is objective as well, so long as you're truthful about it. So, another reason why we have to differentiate ourselves from our thoughts is because when we believe that our thoughts are us, we actually calcify them behind our own ego's defense mechanisms, okay? Part of our survival mechanism itself is protection, okay? We're well within our rights to defend ourselves. And whether we're defending ourselves with our immune system from outside invaders, bacteria and viruses, or through the use of self-defense, defending ourselves from somebody who's trying to murder us or steal from us or something like that, we're well within our rights to do that. And so what actually occurs if you fail to differentiate yourself from your thoughts, if we associate ourselves with our thoughts, what occurs is that we actually look at these thoughts, these beliefs, these ideologies as part of who we are, as part of something that we need to defend, that needs to be protected, because a loss of them would be like a loss of a limb. And suddenly, you're treating these ideas, these thoughts, as your own flesh and blood. And that's weird. And I hope you can already see that there's kind of an issue there with that, because what you see is people who haven't disassociated themselves with their thoughts, they can't even handle questions about their ideas, about their ideologies. Just like a mere question alone would be like you're actually like physically attacking this person. And that's how they're experiencing it themselves. That's how they're subjectively experiencing it. That's why they get so defensive when you just ask them a very simple question. You're just trying to show your interest in what they're talking about. They don't want that. They don't want you to question their beliefs and their ideologies. It's like questioning who they are. And then on top of that, there's this calcification in general. And so once an idea has been determined to be part of who you are, and you decide that you're not going to differentiate yourself from your thoughts, then you'll believe that no one has the right to even question your idea without you needing to defend it as if it's your own flesh and blood. And then it follows, what occurs next is that as part of this defense, what you'll do is you'll get away from people who question you. You'll get away from the very people who challenge you on your thoughts and your beliefs. You will read no literature. You will watch no movies, and you'll speak to no one who doesn't wholeheartedly agree with your idea or your ideology or whatever, simply out of fear that your idea or ideology or your thought, your perceived you, will be attacked. And so, just think about this in terms of a bully. So let's put this in the physical world. Nobody wants to hang out with their bully. And that's how these undifferentiated people are experiencing other people who are just asking them questions. They look at them as like a bully. I don't want to be near that person. That person scares me. That person is attacking me. That's how they look at that. Okay? And so it's literally, to them it'll literally feel like anyone who doesn't just agree with them is physically attacking them. That's an unhealthy way to live your life. Okay? But worse is that your isolation from these questions actually calcifies the idea. And so what that means is that your idea cannot evolve or grow into a better idea because it cannot be challenged. So now you're not actually improving upon your idea because you're avoiding the very thing that your idea needs in order to grow and improve and get better. Just like how we talked about the immune system. The immune system needs to be invaded in order to get more effective at taking down bacteria and viruses. Just like how we, in order to learn, we can actually have experiences, have new challenges in our lives, or learn from a book, inoculate ourselves from right and wrong action that way. It's the same thing with our thoughts and our ideas and our beliefs, And the way that it's done with our thoughts, ideas, and beliefs is through questioning, through the Socratic method, through thinking about this stuff critically thinking about your ideas, about your beliefs, about everything in order to make those ideas and those beliefs and those thoughts stronger. Because the more times that your belief overcomes another question, another round of questions, it gets stronger, it gets more powerful, it gets more closely attuned to reality. You understand all the counterpoints. That's only going to make your belief stronger. It's going to make your belief more closely tied to what is truly going on, to true reality. It's going to make it a more resilient idea as well. Also, on top of that, you may get a string of questions that completely eviscerates your belief. And if your belief is no good, if it's wrong, if it's not in association, if it hasn't associated itself very well to reality, and it just gets blown away by a list of questions, then maybe it wasn't a good belief to have in the first place. And now you have an opportunity to replace that old structure, form of belief, or that old idea with something new, something stronger, something that can weather the storms of questionings and criticisms and all of that stuff. It's all going to make you more resilient and better and offer you better maps in order to be able to traverse the terrain of the reality that we find ourselves in. But the worst part about not disassociating yourself with your thoughts is that you actually lose the ability to think. You actually lose the ability to process information. You lose the ability to put a thought into your head, consider it, judge it, and then choose to accept or reject it. You lose that ability. You have to understand that this idea of processing information, this idea of thinking critically, it's an ability just like any other ability. And in order to keep an ability, the ability must be practiced. You have to do the ability in order to keep the ability improved, healthy, good, strong, a strong ability that you can rely upon to keep it sharp. And if you don't practice or use an ability, then obviously you start to lose that ability. Use it or lose it. Right? Responsibility. And so, your processing abilities, thinking is no exception to this rule about abilities. It's just like any other ability, and the more that you use it, the better your ability becomes. The more that you question things, which is the best thing to do with your thoughts. You have a thought, start questioning it. Hit it with the hows, the whys, and the whats. Trying to figure it out, breaking it apart, bring it back together again, parse it, and then bring it back together again. It's a great thing to do. But you won't be able to do it if you don't first practice this ability and understand that this is an ability. So understand that there are people who are more talented at this ability than you, just more naturally gifted at it than you. That's just part of abilities. So certainly. But again, it's an ability. So if you're behind the eight ball because you don't have the talent, myself included, you can overcome any shortcomings in your ability in thinking by practicing the ability, by working harder, by doing better. And so, like I said, I'm living proof of this. I'm not a very smart person naturally. But the point is that access to the ability to think is given to us by the nature of being human. We have this ability just like we have the ability to learn how to dance. Anyone can do that. You just have to go to dance class and own that ability. And this gets us back to the idea of rights and responsibility. So just by being the nature of being human, we have this right, this ability to think. We have a right to think, but not if you don't take care of that, if you don't own that ability. If you don't own that ability and you let that ability go into disrepair, then you lose that responsibility. And that's what I'm getting to right now, because you can lose your ability to think, all right? And it was Aristotle who may have said that it's the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. A mind really isn't educated when its individual believes that the thoughts that they experience are who they are, because that individual has already determined what is true and what is untrue, and therefore doesn't need to think. They don't want to think. Once you think that you have all of the answers, suddenly thinking, which is a process of uncertainty, you have to go into the realm of uncertainty. This is going from known to unknown. When you're thinking, you don't have the answers. That's why I always say, with Socrates, the only thing that he knows is that he knows nothing. If you start from there and just use the Socratic method and start asking questions, you will come to conclusions. You'll go through the desert and find the promised land. But it's a process of uncertainty, and it's uncomfortable. You don't have to think about abstract ideas or morality or any of this stuff. You just have to think about something. And usually this comes in the form of whatever you're doing. You bump into a point in what you're doing. Let's say you're woodworking. You bump into a point where you don't know what to do, and you have to think about it for a second. So, like I said, utilizing this process of thought and keeping it separated from you, disassociated with yourself, it doesn't really matter what you're doing in life. As long as you're doing something, you're going to bump into times where you have to think. And if you have this ideology that just says you don't have to think because here are all the answers, that's not going to help you. That's not real thinking. That's simulated thinking. We'll talk about that later on. So the final reason why we have to differentiate ourselves from our thoughts is because of where we're going to go in the next couple of videos from now. We understand that thoughts come from our experiences, that thoughts are experiences themselves. And we use our imagination really to amplify them, allow us to focus on certain parts of the experience and really dive into them and delve into them and make them more interesting for us and amplify them. But the thing is that at times you're going to experience things that are horrific, that are perverted, and that are base and disgusting and terrifying. And the point is, me bringing this up is that, again, if you don't differentiate yourself from your thoughts, you're going to think that you are those horrific, perverted, terrifying, disgusting things. Okay? And I understand the idea that we also have positive, tasteful, beautiful, and enjoyable thoughts as well. But the problem is that, well, the more base thoughts, the more horrific, horrifying, disturbing thoughts, those are the thoughts that actually end up being more memorable than the tasteful thoughts. They stick in our memory much more effectively. And, you really don't tell that many stories about the mundane tree that's very pretty and tasteful that you walk by every single day. You've walked by it 600 times. You don't tell people stories about the 600th time that you walked by that tree. But I did already tell you a very uncomfortable, disturbing story, because that's a memorable story. I talked about the ambulance guys, team of ambulance drivers, and the bloodied up, beat up guy. Talked about that, but I didn't talk about the pretty tree that was right next to me that I walked by 600 times, because that's not interesting. And about this memory stuff, I actually spent a few months learning about memory, and I found it very interesting. But when you study memory, one of the first things that they talk about in like the Rhetorica ad Herennium or in Cicero's works, they talk about it's the fact that it's easier to memorize things when you use your imagination to make them exceptionally base, dishonorable, unusual, great, unbelievable or ridiculous. And it's just easier when things are stained with blood or mud or gross and disgusting. It's just easier for us to remember them. And it flows into the idea of the reason why, we have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, from memories that are horrific and traumatic as opposed to memories of butterflies and rainbows. There's something going on with these negative thoughts and those sort of experiences that stick within us much more effectively. And so if you associate yourself as your thoughts, and if your more memorable and vivid and traumatic thoughts will always tend to be of horror or of uncomfortable embarrassment, humiliation, and all of those feelings as well, then you're going to better remember yourself as those things. You're going to think that you are a horrible, perverted, and disgusting person. If those are the things that you remember about your experiences, about your thoughts, and if you haven't differentiated yourself from those things, if you think that you are those things. And so this is kind of important here, because I don't actually want you to hide away from those thoughts of horror, of pervertedness, of tastelessness, of base ideas and thoughts, and those sort of things. I'm actually a big proponent of watching B-list 70s and 80s horror movies because of how violent and gory and disgusting and how uncomfortable they make us. I'm not opposed to feeling uncomfortable feelings. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm just talking about how we can experience these feelings, disassociate ourselves from the thoughts that create these feelings within us, so that we can actually study them and observe them, and then hopefully possibly try to drag out and express the feelings that we're feeling, these very uncomfortable feelings, and share them with the world. You can't do that if you can't go in there, if they're too uncomfortable for you. And so you should allow yourself to have horrible thoughts in order to learn and ultimately become more enlightened. And we're going to talk about what I just said there in a couple of videos, because what I'm really talking about is going into the side of you which allows for your capacity for evil. We have to understand and ultimately accept our capacity for evil, and also accept the unjust nature of existence and the universe itself, because there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there that we can extract, that we can mine out. There's not a whole lot of interesting stuff happening with the rainbows and butterflies, but in this dark and dingy area of the psyche, this shadow, there's a lot going on there, and there's a lot that's unknown to us. And you do this by either experiencing your capacity for evil or by imagining it, and it's much safer to just simply imagine it, and it's just as equal as an experience as real reality, of physical reality doing it, or just imagining it. It elicits the same emotions within us. And so we're going to talk about doing that and how to do that. And but the point of me bringing it up here is to just talk about the capability of actually going in there and allowing yourself to experience these feelings. It's much easier if you do it with this armor on, this by disassociating yourself with the thoughts and the feelings first before getting in there. And that's ultimately the reason why I made this video first and foremost, because we got to go into that capacity for evil. We got to understand what that is. And ultimately, by practicing thought experiments like the ones necessary to come into the shadow, to do the shadow work that we have to do after you've separated yourself from your thoughts, it's like using a scuba suit to dive down into the depths, find the little nuggets of gold, and bring them back safe and sound. And understand that you're still going to feel the feelings, you're still going to experience the thoughts and the emotions and all of that stuff, but the scuba suit protects you enough. It makes the environment down there hospitable, because without it, if you're just down there without a scuba suit, you're dead. It's inhospitable. You can't live down there for very long. So we disassociate ourselves from our thoughts so that we can still experience the pressure, the water pressure, and all the scary things that are down there, but do it at a more objective, perceptive, like scientific, rational level, as opposed to becoming overwhelmed by them. And that's the reason why I made this video. And instead of going on and talking about the shadow and our capacity for evil, which is also an uncomfortable conversation to talk about, I think in the next video, we're going to talk about something a little bit more motivating. We're going to talk about forming the habit of creating your future with your words. And I'm super excited to talk about that future telling sort of stuff, being truthful to yourself and to others about the future in particular, so that you can create the future that you want to live in today. And in the past, that's been something that people have very much enjoyed listening to. So I look forward to doing that in the next video. So I'll see you guys there.